Welcome back to the channel. This is Limitless AI. Imagine building any applications and business solutions, automate complex tasks, and save hours every week, all without writing a single line of code. In this tutorial, you'll discover how to leverage n8n's HTTP request node to unlock limitless possibilities in API integrations. The ability to connect to any API is a developer's superpowers. Let's simplify the concept of API and HTTP requests. An API, or Application Programming Interface, is like a waiter at a restaurant. Imagine you're at a restaurant and you want to order food. You don't go into the kitchen yourself. Instead, you use the menu to tell the waiter what you want. The waiter takes your order to the kitchen and brings back your food. In the same way, an API acts as the waiter between you and a system. It takes your request, like asking for specific information, and delivers the result. With n8n, you don't have to be a programmer to use this process. Its HTTP request node helps you communicate with APIs effortlessly. There are multiple types of API requests. In this tutorial, we'll go through the most commonly used HTTP requests that most developers use in their automations and programs. The first one is the GET request. This type of request allows our programs to retrieve data, like fetching search results. The POST request create new records, such as submitting a new lead to your CRM. This enables us to send data to a server, for example, to create resources and posting them as new records to a database. There's also the PUT request. This allows our apps to update existing records, like modifying contact details from a CRM. A related request type to the PUT request is a patch request, where it can partially update a resource. The last most commonly used HTTP request type is the delete request, where, as the name suggests, it allows us to remove data, for instance, deleting old campaign records. The HTTP request node in n8n is a powerful tool for making API calls to interact with external services. It allows you to send all of these types of requests to APIs, retrieve data, and integrate various services into your workflows. The HTTP request node is used for sending GET, POST, PUT, patch, delete, and other HTTP requests, communicating with REST APIs or webhooks, handling authentication and headers, and parsing responses for further workflow processing. Let's take a look at the anatomy of an n8n HTTP request node. This node is highly configurable and consists of the following key sections. The HTTP method determines the type of operation you want to perform, such as all of the previously mentioned request types. The URL sets up the endpoint you want to interact with. It can include static URLs and dynamic URLs using expressions. The query parameters allows our HTTP calls to add key value pairs to the URL's query string. For example, key equals search, value equals example. The headers are the HTTP headers to include in the request, such as content type, which specifies the type of data, for example, application bar JSON. The body, which is the request payload used in methods like POST or PUT. The body can be of the following formats: a JSON, structured data. A form data is a multi-part form data for file uploads. A URL encoded value, which is a key value pairs encoded for URLs. Or a raw, plain text or binary data. Next is the authentication, which supports various authentication mechanisms. In n8n, there are two options we can use, such as predefined credential types and generic credentials. Predefined credentials are pre-built API integrations provided by n8n for instant use, available for a lot of different API endpoints made available to us. Then, we have generic credentials that are fully customizable by setting up parameters such as a basic auth, which uses a username and password, a OAuth 2, which is a token-based authentication for secure access, like in the case for Google Sheets integrations, and an API key, which allows you to add API keys to headers, query parameters, or the body. You can also include additional options such as response handling, batching, proxy, pagination, and more, which are mostly advanced features that developers use when building REST API integrations. A great example would be from this sample API endpoint shown here for Google SERP API. Here's a pro tip. Always test your requests frequently using the test node feature in n8n to catch errors early. You can also leverage the setting menu for the HTTP request node. You can choose to always output data by toggling this on, or activate the retry on fail option and input value like 3 to make sure that your HTTP request will retry to connect with the API endpoint for 3 times when it fails on the first attempt. Also, you can choose to set up the error handler to continue on error, so your workflow will not get interrupted or stop executing when an error occurs. This is also a good practice when testing your workflow for errors. Let's bring this to life with the Google SERP API as an example. Imagine you're conducting keyword research and need data on search engine results for scraping company LinkedIn data using the Google Search Engine API endpoint. Here's how to connect. First, let's add a new HTTP request node into our workflow canvas. Let's then head over to the Google SERP API documentations. You can access this by creating your own Google SERP API account, where you can find all of the various API endpoints available for developers to integrate. Head over to the Google Search API documentations from the menu. Here, you will have access to a detailed documentations on how to set up your own access to the Google Search API endpoint. As you can see, we have here the URL endpoint we can use to copy and paste into our n8n HTTP request node URL field. This type of request utilizes the GET request. Down below, we can see all of the API parameters we can use to fully customize our API access and integrations to access the data we need for our HTTP request. There are optional and required parameters needed to set up our HTTP API request. Required parameters are needed for this type of API call to work properly, so make sure you include them into your HTTP node parameters in n8n. Now, let's copy the URL and paste this into our HTTP node from n8n. This is a GET request, so let's set the method as default. For the authentication, let's choose None. Let's then set up the query parameters. Here, we can either choose using fields below or use a JSON structure to define our query parameters. In our case, we use the fields option. Let's add the engine parameter to Google. Note, this is an optional parameter, so it will always go by default if you're already using Google as default for your browsers. In my case, I use DuckDuckGo, so I need to set this into Google. Next, let's add another parameter. We need the required query parameter here. This query should contain the value of what we are trying to search for within the Google search engine. In our case, we are trying to search for LinkedIn company profiles. Let's paste our search query. This is the standard query values you enter when searching for LinkedIn company profiles, complete with search criteria and filters. Here, we are looking for tech companies in New York. Let's also add our API key in the query field, which is a required parameter. Let's pass in the key value of API key. Paste our account API key here. We also have the option to add more query parameters based on the documentations. We can add geolocation represented by this GL parameter. We can add a start page to ensure we are going to start at the first page of a Google search result. Also, we can add the num parameter here to define the maximum number of results to return. In our case, we want 10 results. And that's it. We now have a working HTTP request to execute a LinkedIn company search using the Google Search API endpoint. You see, it returns valuable data that we can use and leverage for our specific use case. Here, it returned 10 tech company LinkedIn profiles that can be used for lead generation and other purposes. This is just one example of the many applications we can do with n8n's HTTP request capability. We can do many things to integrate different platforms and applications into our workflow, all without writing a single line of code. Most of the API endpoint we can use to integrate our workflows has this curl code provided for us. This is an easier and more efficient way to set up our HTTP request node within our n8n workflows. We can copy this curl code and heading over to our n8n workflow, we can click on the import curl code from the button here and paste the code into the field. This will then auto-populate our HTTP node with the required parameters to set up the request. We can then further customize our HTTP request by configuring the query parameters. We can leverage the dynamic expressions in our n8n workflow to set up this query parameter based on the input from a previous node. Also, you need to provide your very own API access token or key within the API key field to run this node. Customize your search query by adding in more parameters which are defined in the documentations, like searching by geographic locations, and more advanced parameters which you can see here. Each API endpoint have unique sets of parameters you can leverage to grab and manipulate the data however you want. Let's take a look at another examples. Let's say you want to access and process data from your CRM using database like Airtable. Let's head over to the Airtable API documentations by accessing https://airtable.com/developers/web/API. In this documentations, we can see all the different API endpoints we can use to manipulate and access our Airtable database. Let's do a step-by-step demo on how you can leverage HTTP requests to access our Airtable database within n8n. First, we need to create a database. Here, we created a simple CRM database within Airtable with list of sample leads. Now, we need to set up our credentials to get a personal access token we can use to execute the API call using our n8n HTTP request. From within our Airtable database, let's click on our profile here. Click on the Builder Hub menu. We will then get redirected into the Builder Hub section where we can set up our personal access token. Let's click on Create New Token. Let's give it a name like n8n HTTP Integration Test. We then need to set up the scopes to be able to use the API endpoint for our Airtable database. Let's add everything here to make sure we get full control over our database. Let's then define which base we want our access token to integrate. Click on Create Token button at the bottom, and then we need to copy this personal access token, which we will then use into our n8n workflow. Now that we have our personal access token set up, let's go to the API documentation. What we want to do first is to grab the records from our CRM database using the List Records API. You can see here this is a GET request type. To make this more efficient, let's copy the sample curl code provided. Let's paste this into our n8n HTTP request node from the Import Curl option. Here, we need to edit and define the base ID and the table ID. We can get this by heading over to our Airtable CRM database, and in the URL at the top, let's grab the base ID using this part that starts with the APP. Paste this into our URL field in n8n. Let's also grab the table ID from the URL of our base. This is the part that starts with TBL. Under the header parameters, we need to input our personal access token which we created earlier. In the authorization field, let's paste our token in place of the your token value. Now let's test this request. Here, you can see that it returned the list of records from our specified CRM database. Let's do another one. Add another HTTP request node into our workflow here. Let's update one of the record within our CRM. From the documentations, let's copy the curl code for the update record API endpoint. Now you can see this is a patch request type. Same as earlier, let's set up the base ID and the table ID. We also need to define which record we want to update by selecting the record ID from our database. Under the send body parameter, we need to define which field we want to update. We can choose the body content type we will use to update our record. In our case, we will use JSON. And in the specify body parameter, we have the option to use a JSON structure or use fields below. Let's then define which column from our record we want to update. Let's say we want to update the name of the first record. within our CRM in which we defined from the record ID earlier. We can grab the required body parameters needed for this update record execution by heading over to the introduction menu here at the top. Here, we can view API documentation that is generated for a particular base, where in our case, let's take a look at the example curl code generated from our CRM database. From the menu at the very left, let's choose our CRM table and look for the update/upsert record section. Here, we can see the sample curl code we can use to specify the body parameter in our HTTP node. Let's copy this JSON from the fields item here. Let's paste this into our HTTP node under the send body using JSON field. Let's update the name from Johnny to Adam. Let's test this out. There you go, our record has been updated. Let's do some more examples. Let's use the Create a Record API endpoint to add new record to our database. Same as before, let's create a new HTTP request node. Let's copy the curl code from the Create Record API documentation. This method, as you can see now, is a post request method. Let's fill in the base ID and the table ID. Let's fill in the required details from the API request URL, such as the base ID and table ID, including our personal access token, by copying these details from the previous node we did. In the send body parameters, let's use the JSON structure also by copying the previous node example. Let's fill in the values we want for our new record to be created. Let's execute this and see the results. There it is. A new record has been added to our CRM database. Now for the last HTTP request, we will try to execute a delete request to remove a record from our CRM. Looking at the API documentation, we will need to specify the record ID of the specific record we want to delete. To do this, we need to identify the record ID in a dynamic way. For this example, we will combine two requests. The first one is to list all the records from our CRM database so that we will dynamically grab the record ID of the record we want to delete. The other request should be our delete record action. We have the option to delete a single record and multiple records using an array parameter. For this example, we will do the delete a single record option just to show you how it's done. Let's head back to our n8n workflow and create a new HTTP request node for listing all the records in our CRM. Let's copy the curl code provided for the List Records API. Let's provide the base ID and the table ID in the URL parameter. Let's also add our access token in the authorization field. Let's execute this request. And now, it returns a list of records from our CRM with the corresponding record ID. Next, we need to create another HTTP request node for the delete record execution. Let's copy the curl code and set up all the required parameters. Now we can grab and drop the record ID from the previous node output into the record ID parameter by leveraging the expression format to dynamically specify which record we want to delete. You can customize this part by using a set field node or a filter node to delete records based on a condition. For this example, let's just grab a specific record to delete. Then let's test this out. There you go. The record we specified is now deleted from our CRM. And there you have it. Everything you need to start creating powerful HTTP requests in n8n and connecting to any API like a pro. But don't stop here. To help you take your automation skills to the next level, I've put together a free template of this n8n workflow, which you can use to follow along with this tutorial and learn how to build API integrations yourself. Download it now using the link in the description. If you're ready to scale your business with AI-powered automation but don't know where to start, Limitless AI has you covered. From building advanced lead generation systems to designing sales and marketing automation workflows tailored to your needs, we specialize in using AI to scale and grow your business. Book a free consultation today to discover how we can help. Link also in the description. Finally, if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more tutorials like this. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.